Today, we're going to tell you about the book of Zabira called Will Africa Feed China? The book generally discovers and disproves general myths about the Chinese economic presence in the African continent. So, we're going to cover each of these myths and tell in details about that. The first widespread myth identified in the book is about the large amount of land that China has acquired during its economic activity in Africa. In fact, the size of the land that was granted to the Chinese investors was not that huge. It was only 240,000 hectares. This equals to the area of the two New York cities, which is not crucial to the African continent. This problem attached attention only because of the media and journalists distorting the information about the scale of the Chinese land holdings in Africa. For instance, the case of the Congolese plantation can be considered as an example of this. With this conducted by the ZTE company enterprise was considered by the media as a giant personalization of the land, whilst in fact it was only just a minor prioritization of the land, with actual numbers of 100,000 hectares, while the media made an image of more than 3 million. Both media and the agents of the enterprise. So, Nikita, can you tell us about the second one, please?
Yeah, thank you, Raslav. There is a perception that the Chinese government has a grandiose plan to acquire land in Africa through its financial schemes. However, this too is a myth. Huge funds have not been earmarked for land purchases, but more for economic stimulation tools. For example, if you look at the LPHT, you will notice that they promoted tools to boost the economy, technology and agribusiness plans, and gave African farmers the basis for building profitable farms. In addition, the LPHT launched agricultural technology demonstration centers, which were built under a Chinese aid program. They were supported to improve the weak support systems for agricultural research in Africa. Longping High-Tech won the tender to build and manage the Liberian ATDC, and the centers were fully funded by the Chinese government, which also provided operational support for 3 years. The companies and their hosts have since agreed on the next steps. In Liberia, the LPHT has agreed to finance and run the center for 12 years, funding staff training and 10 studies from its own revenues, creating a commercial farm that local entrepreneurs can replicate or model. So thus, it can be concluded that China has not tried throughout its shady schemes to run the African land, but has instead openly, with UNICEF's participation, boosted the African economy by providing its technology and showing by example options for building profitable farms. So in other words, these funds are part of the portfolio of multiple and varied tools employed by an active Chinese government, a developmental state, trying to jumpstart its firms' global agribusiness prospects. So, Philippe?
Yeah, thank you, Nikita. I think next we should address a popular myth that China is building its empire and expanding it using different economic tools. So the myth states that Chinese entrepreneurs and the party itself entered African agriculture to support its growing food demand. However, according to Brottingham's interview 2017, popular misconceptions about China and European colonialist experience towards Africa led to the initial misunderstanding of what the Chinese were doing there. First of all, this myth neglects the fact that Africa is the biggest food deficient region, World Bank study 2014 reports that even in the most developed African countries like Nigeria, farming is predominantly substantial and localized, and it does not leave the local markets, local village markets. In that fashion, nations of Africa need to develop modern large-scale commercial agriculture before they can satisfy the very basic Chinese demands. Hence, it leaves one with two other possibilities to describe the situation. Either the party is conducting a far-going plan to establish the assumed system, or the Chinese are aspiring to invest their capital's excess in a promising region to gain extra profits. Without researchers' access to government papers, the former possibility is a mere conspiracy theory, and we can't really address that. So the latter, on the other hand, implies further investigation. Chinese financial and technological capital, African soil and production, but there is something missing. It is the one who assumes the customer's role. It surprisingly appears to be the European Union. For instance, despite their limited protectionism, Africa still exports up to 3 million tons of sugar. What is more, since the WTO constantly forces the EU to lower their barriers, sugar prices might rise dramatically with the further removal of export subsidies. Thus, as a Chinese investor, we together in this room see that although weak state bureaucracy and economic backwardness of the region possess a significant obstacle, Africa is a rather promising asset. Economically speaking, it is a matter of technological development and the enlargement of the farmlands. So considering the mentioned obstacles and requirements, it eliminates doubts about what Chinese are doing in the region. Therefore, if one raises their concern whether China will build a excuse me, let me start that thing because my accent is not that good. Therefore, if one raises their concern whether China will build a paddy field out of African continent to fuel their expansion against the West, their opponent would point out, after taking Brottingham's insights into consideration, that their concern lacks localization. If one addresses the issue of Chinese economic plot to undermine the West, they might look closely at European inputs and not at Sino-African relations. Timur, will you tell us about the last myth we offer debunks?
Yeah, we also want to cover a popular myth about China's plans to move millions of their workforce in Africa. In fact, there was no plan for the immigration of Chinese farmers, Chinese workers. Many big businessmen talked about it and supported this idea, but in reality, there was no plan or opportunity to send millions of Chinese to work in Africa so easily. Even if you look at ready-made Chinese projects in Africa, such as Sino-Zambian Friendship Farm, one of the first Chinese commercial investments in Africa, there were only a few employees from China, 30 professionals, and the rest of the workforce was recruited from Africa. In addition, China's plans to send its workers to Africa failed due to civilian protests. The farms built by China in Mauritania were highly profitable, but the Mauritanian government decided to privatize the farms for itself, forcing China to sell them. The moves raised purchase prices and taxes on imports. This policy by African leaders was because China planned to use its workers on the farms, using African land, but ignoring the local population. There was also the case of the construction of a cocoa processing plant in Ghana in 1997, and its subsequent near full commissioning in 2003, which was threatened by a change of government in Ghana that refused to verify a previously guaranteed loan for a fear that corporation owner would be unable to repay the loan. This situation was also due to China not planning to use African workers and the Ghanaian government choosing to disrupt the launch of the plant. Thus, China wasn't really planning to send people to Africa, and private corporations planning such ideas were on the verge of failing in Africa due to protests by Africans themselves. Yaroslav?
Thank you. In conclusion, Chinese image of the imperialistic power that uses poor African countries literally as colonies, which was formed by media, basically, is far from reality. In fact, China just wanted to find new ways for economic development and acquire the access to the resources of the continent. In many ways, modest attempts of Chinese entrepreneurs to establish economic presence on the continent were far from the absolute success, with only few enterprises running on the territory of the continent. Some of them were even closed due to inefficiency. China acted just as a market player on the territory of Africa, without deliberate creation of the new institutions on the continent, which can be considered as the reason why its presence is still limited. So that was it. Thank you for your attention and goodbye.